There is a little known 1997 Hollywood movie that perfectly predicts the war propaganda that we've seen around Ukraine and the Western proxy war on Russia. It also really perfectly predicts US government propaganda on the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the two wars in Iraq, and many other conflicts. This movie is called Wag the Dog. It's not really well known. It's kind of become a cult classic, but I had a great time in this episode sitting down with a friend of mine, Sina Rahmani. He is the founder and the host of the excellent podcast, The East is a Podcast. I have a link to his show in the description below this video or this podcast if you're watching or listening. Definitely go check out his show. Sina and I sat down and we had a really fun discussion about this movie, Wag the Dog. And it's going to surprise you how many incredible parallels there are to this 1997 movie and the U.S. war in Iraq, which began in 2003, the U.S. war in Syria, which began in 2011, the U.S. war in Libya, also 2011, and the ongoing proxy war in Ukraine. So without further ado, I'm Ben Norton. This is my discussion with friend of the show, Sina Rahmani of The East is a Podcast.
This is a special co episode. We're doing it together. We're sharing this episode because I think it speaks to a lot of our shared audience. It's basically a kind of like story of astroturfing. They don't use the term in the movie, but and it's very interesting. So, okay, we are here to talk about what movie, Ben?
Wag the Dog. This is a 1997 little known Hollywood movie, but a cult classic about a president who is facing a sex scandal after, abusing a young girl. And his team tries to create a fake war in the media to rally the population so he can be reelected. And although it was made in 1997, it's, basically a documentary for every single U.S. war in the past 20 or 30 years, especially the war in Ukraine. It is crazy how many parallels there are between the ongoing proxy war on Russia and Ukraine and this movie from 1997. It's more relevant now than it was then.
Yeah, it really is. And there's so many things. Okay, so we should probably get into the plot of it. The basic plot, as you said, is that there's this political scandal 2 weeks before the election, or like 11 days or something before the election date. And the sitting president, is basically a kind of like avatar for Bill Clinton. And this was a popular thing in the 90s. I think there's another movie along these lines that's the kind of fake send up. It's Primary Colors. It's kind of a fake Clinton movie. And this guy is kind of like that. The president. He's actually a very, very minor character in this movie, if at all.
You never see his face, which is cool.
Yeah, which is a very smart
because it shows who actually has power in Washington. Exactly. It's not the president.
Exactly. And it's funny that at the beginning they that's the framing device of this movie is that, okay, here's the scandal, this big name hot button political scandal that will in fact become public. It's not about keeping it out of the public eye, because it will be public, but it's about, and the term they use is distraction. It's about distracting people with this war, what turns out what is a complete and utter fake war, manufactured war called against Albania. And the real sort of plot of the movie is the production of this war. And so there is the actual political part of it, or like the political characters. They're pretty minor, and it's the deep state, as it were. And it's funny that at the beginning of the movie, where they call in Robert De Niro's character, Conrad Breen, they call him in, the kind of top people in the administration, the top political people. They call him in and say, "Oh, you're Mr. Fix-It."
He's a public relations expert.
Yeah, he's the kind of public relations Mr. Fix-It, kind of like, and they go deep down below whatever building they're in. Like, I think they're in the White House, actually. And they go deep down below, and it's this kind of like, it's this, it's tongue in cheek. And this is not the language at the time that we use, but it is a glance into the deep state and how it functions.
It's like the room in Doctor Strangelove. That's like basically the room.
Basically. And so like that, this begins, and it's right there where you begin to learn that, like, Robert De Niro's character Conrad Breen is this master political operator, and he's this kind of spinner of narrative where he begins he like gets kind of like he gets kind of debriefed on what happens very quickly. It's very quick, and it's actually really good because you're kind of in his position for the beginning of the movie. You're like, oh, what happened? You're like, oh, and then they explain it, and it's a good narrative exposition tool. That
Well, we
opening
should
kind
say
of
what
deep state
happened is
leading.
that the president like sexually abused this teenage girl.
A
I mean, which is
Firefly girl who was visiting
which
the
is
White House.
and this movie, by the way, came out like mere days before the Monica Lewinsky scandal came out. So extremely
That's true.
prescient in many ways.
Yeah, and so this guy Conrad Breen is manufactured to lead the production of this distraction. And the distraction that they choose he comes up with eventually is this war with Albania, right? And this is where the movie sort of takes off. I mean, there's so many places we can go with this. I mean, maybe we should start with the meaning of the title, because what did you originally? I kind of didn't get it. I really didn't. I mean, I understood it literally, but I kind of didn't think about the sort of like nuances of it, because Wag the Dog is a kind of like kind of turning on the head of this expression of like a dog wagging its tail, and it begins. There's this kind of title card at the beginning. It says, "Why does a dog wag its tail?" And then the answer is because a dog is smarter than its tail. And then there's a new title card, and it says, "If the tail were smarter, the tail would wag the dog." What did you kind of think of that title? Like, what did you make of it?
Well, no, I think it's a really good metaphor. It's pretty clear. The president is not actually in charge. It's all these other people behind the scenes. And you mentioned the deep state. So in this movie, you also get different intelligence agencies. The military gets involved, and of course, they're all involved to help rig this election, basically, for the sitting president. And then Hollywood gets involved, and you see the power of the U.S. cultural apparatus. Honestly, people talk about the U.S. military empire, the 800 some military bases around the world. Obviously, that's the main hard power keeping the U.S. empire on top, but also the U.S. soft power through Hollywood in horrible movies and TV shows, most of which are written with the input of the U.S. intelligence agencies and military. They are a huge part of this, and they're a huge part of maintaining the U.S. empire. So, I mean, they are wagging the dog. It's not the president that's in charge. It's this Hollywood producer who gets brought in, and he's played by Dustin Hoffman. And he basically, throughout the movie, he's like, I'm the one in charge. This is my production, not the president. So like there's a part where like he has arguments with the president. Like there's this part where they're making this fake video of this Albanian girl, like it's like a White Helmets thing, right? And I immediately thought of the White Helmets. We'll talk about that in a second. But they're making this fake video of an Albanian girl with a cat running from like fake bombing to try to like tug at the heartstrings of people in the US on the media. And there's this part where Dustin Hoffman, who's this Hollywood producer overseeing the production, he wants to have a cat that has like different colors on like the cat's fur. And then the president wants the cat to be white. And then the Hollywood producer is like, this is my production, Mr. President. So it's showing that he's the one wagging the dog, right? And honestly, being a U.S. president does not give you that much power. Look at Joe Biden. That guy, he's the perfect symbol of it. He doesn't do anything.
That guy isn't even in charge of a can of tuna if he tried. That guy couldn't do anything. He's like this walking ghost. Well, so it's interesting. I never saw the wag the dog angle from that way. I was thinking of it today because I never thought about the title very seriously. But there's also another thing of that, like a dog wags its tail as like the tail wagging is an expression of emotion, right? It's saying it's communicating something, right? And so one is the agent and one is the object of expression, or kind of the linguistic expression of that feeling, right? So if a dog feel good or whatever, happy, they wag their tail. If they're interested, they wag their tail, right? And so, but then the inverse of this, which is, and that's kind of the relationship between power and the media, or like media and the people, right? Is that the people are going to reflect, and that's kind of what's at stake in this movie. Is something there's a kind of the overall arc of this is interesting because on the one hand, this was done before the internet, right? And so there are these finite number of publications that they kind of navigate through, and they have to kind of use those as the compass. Like, oh, Washington Post has it, New York Times has it, whatever. Typical kind of boomer thinking of like, what are the big venues? What are they saying? And that is a kind of barometer of the public, right? That is kind of an expression of something. However, is that this movie is about the motion of history, which is the dog, right? Like the active subject of history is in fact being controlled by its supposed expression, right? Of the tail. Is that the tail is telling the dog like what to do and where to go and how to sort of feel. And so that's kind of like the way I took it, is that this is about choreographing emotions. And the other thing about this, there's another thing about like the nature of the task at hand, is that the one hand they have this kind of very 2000s framing, which is, oh, nuclear terrorism that's going to destroy our way of life, right? Which
By
was
Muslims.
by Muslims, right? I mean, of course, that preceded the 2000s, but that was like the logic of like the 2000s was like, oh, it's defensive imperialism, right? It's like against these rogue states, and of course, that was before, that was 80s too. Sure, there was like the fear of Libya and whatever, but like the language of the 90s is famously like art, like the they love to use this term, the R2P, right? The right to protect, and so these
Well, and
movies
Sina, and
conflate
what
them.
what's also very interesting about that is it also shows how much the politics have kind of shifted. In some ways, it's the same, but in some ways, it's shifted, right? So in the movie, you never see the president's face, and at the beginning, when the scandal first breaks out, he's in China, and this is of course, this is the 1990s, 1997. This is the moment of peak U.S. unipolarity, when China was basically forced to take this subservient position to not be destroyed and overthrown like Russia was, like the Soviet Union was. So in the 1990s, of course, the U.S. has basically colonized Russia, overthrown the Soviet Union. This U.S. puppet Boris Yeltsin's in charge. And then China is forced to basically subordinate itself while it's trying to grow its productive forces and lying low and biding time. That's what Deng Xiaoping famously said, lie low and bide time. So China wasn't seen as like the so-called threat that it is now. So at the beginning of the movie, the president's in China, and it's not even like seen as a big deal. Whereas now, I mean, obviously the US president would never just be hanging out in China, right? So in that time, there were no so-called threats to the US empire. Instead, it was just like this vague idea of terrorism, and they had to create it, which is a perfect analogy for the war on terror that came a decade later, right? They had to create the myth of the terror threat that they use to justify what they're doing.
Yeah, no, and that's the story of like U.S. empire, is that you manufacture the very sort of like video store cutout, cardboard cutout of like the action of the evil character who's going to come and murder you and your family like where they sleep, right? And this is the classic. But in this movie, that there's actually like two things. There's the R2P argument, and then there's the defensive imperialism, because they're just what the goal of this isn't sort of any kind of rationality, obviously. Like they're just making things up in the hopes of distracting the media, right? That the media are seen as these outside actors. This is the most bullshit thing about this movie, incidentally, is that if this movie were true, they would have way more people in that first room, or at least there would be a person who would be in charge of disseminating this to like
Thomas
hundreds,
Friedman.
yeah, like hundreds of people who would then say like, "Oh, is this the talking point? Are we doing China and Uyghurs now? What's a Uyghur?" Okay, like there would be a kind of like relay at that point. Now, it's
Sina, do you remember the Obama White House visitor logs? And Thomas Friedman was in there like a
yeah,
dozen
yeah,
times.
God,
All these, like David
oh,
Ignatius,
all these
all the journalists, they just
flunkies,
hang out at the White House
yeah.
and they get told what to say.
Like you think of that like, oh, it can't be like that. Like my own inclination is to be like, it can't be like that because it's more sophisticated. And it's sometimes I'm like, yeah, the US ideological apparatus, whatever you want to call it, is more sophisticated because a lot of people buy into it without the material sort of like material relation of say being a propagandist, right? A lot of people do the work of the US empire on their own for free and like are excited to do it. They're doing it ideologically. And that's the mark of a successful ideological operation, right? That like it can do that. Now, however, that there's this great point in the movie where he's talking about, oh, we did yellow ribbons, and they talk about the fact that during the so-called hostage crisis. I mean, look at my episode, don't call it a hostage crisis. Um, is that the so-called hostage crisis in Iran, in the US embassy in Tehran? is that there is this spontaneous act of putting yellow ribbons around and everything. And Heche's character, who's kind of naive at the beginning, is like, "Oh, but that was some spontaneous thing, was that?" And then kind of like the implication is like, "Oh, that was AstroTurf too," and that was like, and you wonder like, "Oh my god, is that true?" Like,
Well, and then
of
you
course it's
Iran
true.
Contra. Yeah.
Like, of course it's true, right? Like that the idea that there are these kind of natural cultural things that are outside of the power of marketing, which, as we all know, is very weak and very minor in our society. That marketing plays no role. That it only limits itself to hamburgers and radio sets and cars and stuff. That it never enters into our total political conversation, not at all. And so, like, that for me at the outset was like, oh, that's interesting. There's the kind of, and the best, that scene with the woman who's it's Kirsten Dunst. It's a very young Kirsten Dunst. And they're like, there's this whole
That Kirsten Dunst plays the Albanian
yeah,
girl who's pretending to be like
yeah.
in this village that's being bombed, but she's just like at this big green screen. And instead of
She's
and
holding
like
chips.
they want to have her holding a cat, but instead of a cat, it's a bag of chips. And they're like, "We'll fix it in post.
Yeah.
We'll change it in post." And they use special effects to make it look like she's running in a village in Albania. And they keep like changing the sound behind her.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
That
And
scene is so
Sina,
good.
in that
I love
entire
that scene.
scene,
Yeah.
I kept thinking of the white
Yes.
helmets. Like that is literally what
That's
they
what
did
they
with the
did,
white
yeah.
helmets.
Well, the people who made that White Helmets movie never stepped foot in Syria. They never went to Syria. The people who got the award for it, it was perfect. It's as if they're telling you, it's like, yeah, this was a creation of the West. We got a bunch of footage from these freak, like, ISIS guys, and we're gonna turn them
Some
into
of which
first
was
responder
fake.
heroes.
Like never forget. I mean, I'll put the footage here. The footage
The
of the white helmets doing the mannequin
mannequin
challenge,
challenge.
which was the greatest gift they ever gave us because it's like, by the way, we have every skill that we need to fake these videos. So how do we know which one is real and which one's fake?
And that was not a mistake. They did that. That I refuse to believe that was a mistake. They do. The U.S. empire signals its own fictitiousness. Like I'm like a literary person by training, and so you're trying to like understand like how does this work? There's no model for ideology that I can use to understand this because on the one hand you have the crass, what we think of as the crass Soviet information style, where you had this official place where that had these sinews connected to the state, and then they would disseminate information. And like that's probably wrong. That's not how it was. I'm sure it wasn't as stupid as that. But that's our image of it, right? But the US has that. The US does have that. It's a bit hidden. It's not as thing, but like actually it's not even hidden. They called it embedded journalism anyways. So like the US does that. We know that. And the idea, and then on top of that is that what are the actual actors of the news, right? The so-called fifth estate. What constitutes the fifth estate, and this is like the liberal belief, is that you have these people who are outside of power, supposedly, who have taken upon themselves to track power and all of its actions, and then they're paid presumably by news corporations, which are vying for these radical news that will get people's attention, right? Like this is the liberal mind thinking: is that okay? If you pay a bunch of people some money to go track down dirt on politicians, this is how we do democracy. And this is how you get never-ending documentary about, oh, like whatever, Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and the fucking whatever, the dummy twins, what are they called? Humpty and Dumpty, the Washington Post guys. I can't remember.
Bob Woodward and
Bernstein
Carl
and
Bernstein.
Finkelmeyer. I don't even care. Woodward and Bernstein. like that's how you get this vaunted status of guys like that, right? Like these muckraking journalists. But what are we talking about in reality? Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. One family, what are they called? Salzburgers, whatever. One liberal Democrat family owns the New York Times, right? Like Bill, Microsoft guy. I can't remember his name for a second. Bill Gates is like owns Vox and a ton of other stuff. Like this is a handful of guys who own the media apparatus, and it's in their interest to go along with the U.S. state. It's not in their interest to rock the boat and be like, "Oh, there's a dirty war in Syria, guys. Don't boost it." Like it's not in their interest, so they just like follow the stream. So we're in this weird way of like you have the
You mentioned Bob Woodward.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. I mean, even them, like these guys are credited for Watergate. Watergate, which was, by the way, a CIA operation. And if people should look up Bob Woodward's links to the CIA, like he was a poster boy for the CIA, basically. And then also Carl Bernstein, I mean, he was a little more independent than Woodward, but he had a very friendly relationship with the CIA. So even like these heroes that are seen as like examples of supposed muckraking journalism are just fed this stuff by the national security state.
For their own reasons as well, right? Like Woodward and Bernstein had a source. It was Mark Felt, whatever. Who knows who put Mark Felt up to it? Now, of course, the liberal imagination refuses to kind of imagine that things like Wag the Dog exist. They just refuse. I've just seen this in action, like online and stuff, and how people talk, and like they just like they'll say the fact that okay, there was this. What was it? What was the group that Lynn Cheney and one of the I think it was Elliot Abrams. It was like the Syria group. Like that was a group. There was a group of people who sat down. They're like, how can we destroy this 5,000-year-old country? Like, how can we do that? What assets do we have? And that's what they did. And it was carried on. It was continued by Obama. It was actually enacted by Obama and company. Like there's a passing of the baton, and then it was continued by Trump in the form of Caesar sanctions and outrageous acts of giving the green light to the Israelis to do their daily every 10-day terrorism sprees with their
And occupying the oil-rich regions, and then Trump just saying out openly, "Keep the oil. We're there to keep the oil."
proudly proclaiming it. Like we went from and people, and then of course there is the even crazier aspect of all this is that 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, the second invasion, where an entire global, coalition came together and said no, said we don't buy no blood for oil. It's turned into like, well, it's a dirty civil war. Sorry, folks. People arguing for the dirty war, like like proudly sort of. So like there is a ideologically, I would say the U.S. is stronger in its imperialism. If you want to say that strength is measured by the amount of capital I influence over, let's say, mainstream media. Now, mainstream media, the meaning of it has changed since 20 years. Right, 20 years ago we didn't have social media. 20 years ago we didn't have this necrotic media system. Like you still had these legacy newspapers, you still had legacy news channels, which are, I guess you still have them now, but they have a fraction of their power. But like, I guess what this movie was so interesting is that you get to see or you get to imagine how these things are cooked up. And you see the kind of like all-star team of people put together of talents of there's the music guy, there's like Dennis Leary's character,
It was played by Willie
yeah,
Nelson.
Willie Nelson. And there's like the obligatory like group like high like group song, right? Like ensemble song of people.
Live
Live
Aid,
Aid.
like all those Live
There's
Aid
this
songs they did. They bring
beautiful, yeah.
together all the celebrities to sing like each one line in this really crappy
Yeah,
song.
yeah,
It's amazing, and the lyrics are like, "How great
yeah,
democracy is," and "Long live American democracy." And of course, they're singing for this fake war
yeah.
to prop up a president who's rigging the election, and that's what they
Yes.
mean by great American democracy.
It's so
It's
good.
perfect.
Like this is such good satire. Like there's so because I think Americans don't produce good satire because because of the level of ideology enforcement upon them where like they can't say anything nice about any of their enemies to begin with, but they can only kind of lampoon their own class and even then to a certain extent, right? That like you can make fun like Stephen Colbert and them can make fun of Trump all they want, but when it comes to one of their own, Obama, they fall in line, right? Like they all right? And I guess there is the unique thing in this movie of like the unique role of liberal Hollywood because Hollywood is liberal. Like it is a liberal bastion. It's a solidly liberal institution of like the American whatever you want to call it, whatever it is, like culture industry. Like it is dominated by liberals. And like unabashedly, and there's absolutely no way their power could be broken over it. And so, like inside of that, you get to see how there is this curated material for different kinds of audiences because there is this sort of like heart tugging stuff of like, oh, the girl who just escaped being raped by terrorists holding the like Tostitos bag. And then there's like the scene later where they go and greet a mother and they give this, oh, the first sheath of the wool, which is like what Robert De Niro just makes up. He just like makes up these cultural things. But then there's later they bring it to a more, let's say, like down home, like country boy audience, where they bring this war hero home, and he's supposed to represent, played by Woody Harrelson, and he's some deranged like U.S. sicko mercenary murdering psycho. And because his name is Schumann, they find him and they use him because it curates nicely with their song, which was like good old shoe. And so like they wrote the song first and then they found a guy to play the role that the song plays. And then it turns out he's a complete psycho.
Well, even better, Sina. So, and I mean, I love it. Shows how everything is fake. Everything is completely artificial. So they get Willie Nelson to come in to write a song, and they're like, make it sound like an old country song from the 1930s, and then they put it in the Library of Congress as if it's from the 1930s. So then, and then they send it to the media, and the media is like, wow, someone discovered this song that's from the Library of Congress from the 1930s about William Shue. I mean, everything is fake. But you know what I love about this movie, though, is that, Sina, there's a few times where the presidential aide, this like young woman who works for the president, she keeps saying to the Hollywood producer and to Robert De Niro's character, so Dustin Hoffman is the Hollywood producer, De Niro is the PR guy, and she keeps saying to him, yeah, but that's not true. And they're like, you don't get it. It doesn't matter that it's not true. We create reality, which is, of course, exactly what the Bush administration was saying. Remember, like during the Iraq War, they were like, yeah, we create reality.
Yeah, and it's actually that's the most cutting thing of this movie. It seems dumb now because we're so like Matrix pilled, like especially our generation, we're like that sense of like the way that people say like, oh, this is all a simulation. Even that itself is like hackneyed because it's not a simulation. It's actually very real. These people are very real. They're not fake. Like they're human beings and you can see them right there and they're flesh and blood and whatever. Kavanaugh lives in a house. It's all very normal. But people, I think that especially in our kind of like we're oversaturated in information and textuality all the time. Like we have it thrown at us. And so we can only navigate it through, like allusions to the West Wing or something that like, oh, we can only make sense of it through like our shared cultural text, and like the way that this movie, then you see how those shared cultural things are wholly manufactured very cynically and like divided up and packaged like it's some perfect like Hello Fresh or whatever meal, like one of those meal packet kits. Like it's so orchestrated and it's like so utterly sinister that it can that its fictionality is so like enforced and so like obvious for us that I just think of like Justin Trudeau going to the Toronto Pearson Airport to welcome this like hand-picked batch of Syrian refugees who are like victims of this dirty war supported by his ilk and also the Canadian state as well in compliant in sort of working in lockstep with the media apparatus. So like these people are like they're meeting the people who helped cook up their situation and they're forced to like take pictures with them. And you're like, what is the difference between that and Saddam Hussein, like sitting with that American kid, right? Is that's Saddam Hussein meeting with a hostage, but Justin Trudeau meets with this nice little refugee, and it's this heartwarming scene. I mean, you can put a picture in here, and there's a ton of them, right? And there's a ton of refugee porn. I mean, that's the kind of mind blowing is that there is propaganda for every variety of subject of our society. That this propaganda and like this kind of information war is tailored for every different kind of audience, and it comes to us via the channels that are dedicated to us, and it's all very choreographed and it's all very orchestrated. Like I remember, and you can, I mean, if you want, you can put this in too. Sorry, I'm creating work for you, but I remember the ridiculously good-looking Syrian rebel, right? This is a meme, okay? This is a meme that was first posted on Reddit of like a guy holding like an RPG. He wasn't even good looking. He was just some like regular looking like Syrian guy. He just didn't look like a bearded Salafi freak the way we think of like, oh, Arabs are these ugly human beings. And oh, wow, here's one that looks normal. And so like this got the guy to qualify as ridiculously good looking, and it became this whole meme. And there were articles about it in Foreign Policy, Ben. There was an article about a meme in Foreign Policy. You can look it up. You can clip it here if you want. And there was like 4 different articles. If you type in ridiculously good-looking Syrian rebel meme, you will find 4 articles all published within like a week or 10 days of each other. And it's like, could you guys try to make it look less coordinated? And like somebody sent out an either like, we need 10,000 words on this stupid fucking meme cooked up in New York somewhere. Like that's astroturfing live. Like that is actual astroturfing. Maybe we should talk about the term astroturfing because it is an American term and it actually has American resonance because people don't know what astro or turf is. That actually is a real thing. Maybe you can do it.
Yeah, and I mean, AstroTurf is the fake grass that are used in sports stadiums. So obviously, it's a lot of work to maintain real grass, and especially if you're like playing outside in the summer and the winter. So you just use like this fake grass, which is called AstroTurf, and that's exactly how all of these, you know, NGOs fund so-called civil society, and they fund so-called, you know, protests and movements and all this stuff. It's complete astroturfing. It's fake grass. It's not grassroots. It's fake grass. It's astroturfing. And the media plays such a huge role in this. Now, I mean, I wrote down a few of these quotes, Sina, because some of these quotes were amazing. When, like I said, there's in this movie, you see a lot of arguing between the president, again, who's faceless. I love the fact you never see his face. It's just this faceless figurehead who has no real power. And there's this part where he's arguing, and the Hollywood producer is complaining because the president says the war ended, right? And the Hollywood producer says, this is exact quote in the movie, "The war isn't over until I say it's over." And then he's talking about the president, and he says, "He can't end the war. I'm producing it." Talk about astroturfing. I mean, they get a Hollywood producer, one of the most powerful people in society, right? Not a politician. They're not powerful. Hollywood producers. They're the ones who decide what people think and see, especially in this era now. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, like with COVID and people like locked inside more. People interact often more online and more with movies and TV shows than they do with real people in person, right? So the horrible garbage that we consume like on Netflix and HBO and all this, and Disney Plus or whatever, like for a lot of people, that has more of an impact on them than real life does because they don't even interact in flesh and blood with a lot of people anymore. And there's obviously a lot of bad things there. I'm not saying that it's all like dystopian and like I'm not saying that there are good things and bad things, right? But it's incredible the power that the culture industry, and it's an industry, has on people. It's not done for for the good of society. It's done to make money and to advance certain government interests.
The line, and this is the great sort of thesis between this movie, is that the line between like news and entertainment is completely fake and it never has existed. That like especially in a place like the US where it has a large population that has easy access to all kinds of different kinds of information, and let's say a certain elite access to different kinds of information in the sense that like we have fast internet, we have the English language also on our side, so there's a ton of like resources. A huge chunk of the world speaks in English, so you have all these things going for it. But then if you're like an evil deep state operative of the US empire, like how can we ensure that we don't have too much thought crime? Like, oh, let's create like all kinds of alternatives. Let's create a kind of broad spectrum of political beliefs that can counteract, that we can call upon. Now, in the case of that, because there is there's always like two kinds of information. There's two sides to an information war. There's the information war that's intended for domestic consumption, and then there's the one for export, right? That then is then exported to those foreign countries like Lebanon. Lebanon is just a bloodbath of NGOs and fake astroturf organizations, just running with them. And they're very common, right? Because it's a good way to get a job. You don't need to run a ton of people. You don't need to rent an office, right? Like you can make anything look like anything else. And this is like the lesson that I come back to again and again, is that because of the importance of what you were saying, the importance of this data in our life, of like these pixels and this audio and these movies and texts and whatever, like the importance of these things to our lives, because we are limited to our communities, that we are limited by like the fact that we're overworked and we are, that like we don't get vacations, that like whatever. So we rely upon these means of communication and these kinds of textualities, to put it in a stupid academic way, but like that we rely on this like cultures of text to then build our understanding in the world and our own political selves, right? It becomes so important to push hard on good and bad countries, right? Like country good, like it's good that this country did this, and it's good that this leader did that, right? And usually, and then but then it's the more important thing is that, oh, there are all these bad countries, right? That China is one of them, Russia is one of them. I mean, we have just seen, like, in the last 3 months, we have seen the complete hypocrisy of the entire sort of Western liberal order, in the sense that you have all these people who say these things that, oh, country X closes like doesn't allow for free flow of information, like country Y shuts down political discussion. Like, that's all the things that the first thing the US did. It shut down RT, it shut down like and everywhere in the world.
RT was the most popular news outlet in all of Latin America, everywhere. Like Google, it also shows the power of these big tech corporations. Google was just like turned off the switch and said no more Russian media.
Like, all those principles go out the door, right? Like right away.
I mean, on the subject of Russia and Ukraine, we have to talk about the parallels to Ukraine and Zelensky and all of this. I mean, the entire time I was watching this movie, I just kept thinking about Zelensky. This guy is the embodiment of Wag the Dog, right? Zelensky, for people who don't know, he had a TV show. He's an actor, and the reason he became famous is because Zelensky had this crappy TV show. I watched every episode. It's on HBO, and I think it used to be on Netflix, might still be. It's called Servant of the People. It's this like low-budget, awful TV show that was made in Ukraine, and it was funded by these very same billionaire oligarch who funded his political campaign. So in this TV show, Zelensky is this actor. He's an actor, of course, but in the TV show, he plays a teacher, a high school teacher. And then he has this rant like against corruption. It's this like dumb, stupid, like so-called populist rant with like no actual political content other than like corruption.
It's always corruption. Corruption is always the thing. Like, oh, corrupt government. We want change. But it's never sort of narrated any specifics.
Yeah, and it's this vague idea, like, of course, everyone's against corruption, but it's so vague that you can use it to push any political position you want. So his like student, and in this TV show, Servant of the People, his student films Zelensky, his teacher, giving this rant, and then it goes viral on social media, and then he ends up becoming like, it's not really clear, like someone like writes him in as candidate, and then he accidentally wins the election, and he becomes president. And then he's a completely incompetent president, by the way, in this TV show. And he implements like IMF neoliberal structural adjustment programs. And he's an awful president, but he's not corrupt. So like, that's how he became popular, Zelensky. And then he created a political party that was funded by the billionaire oligarch who funded that TV show. And then the political party that Zelensky was created was called Servant of the People, which is literally the name of his TV show. And then he won the election. And then immediately when he came in, he just did a 180 on all his promises. He claimed he wanted peace with Russia. He spoke Russian on the political campaign, on the presidential campaign. And then immediately he comes in, he does a 180, and he's a loyal servant of Washington, not of the people. He's a U.S. puppet. And now we see Zelensky is like, he's not a real president. All he is he's a media figure. He appears on TV screens and he pretends like he's leading the country, which is actually being led by the U.S., the U.S. puppet regime, and the military services, which are like chock full of these fascists and far-right extremists. And then Zelensky just like appears on Zoom calls all day,
talking
his,
to like Stanford
t-shirt.
graduates and like just like catering to liberals. That's what's crazy, is that like he's doing this nonstop media tour for liberals specifically, like because what's funny is that like the nature of US elections, right, and like people sort of political affiliations is that, well, I hate war, but this is the war my guy waged, so I'll support it, right? So like Republicans are generally against or more against this war, even though they love war and they're happy to go along with things, and they, because I think for some, at least they're kind of media figures, they like Putin because he's anti-liberal, right? And so they like that he like sticks it to liberals. And it's also the fact that like he makes them see red. So there's like a weird affiliation with him. And even if it's not even with him, that there is this correctly critical of the US empire's role in Ukraine. Now, let's see them apply that to the rest of the world. They won't do that. It's convenient now. We all know that it's not principled there. whatever, like Biden or what, not Biden, I can't remember. One of the Trump sons, like I think like they all are like eating up, but it's only just like political opportunism, like everything in the US. Like it's just for now. If they get into power tomorrow, they would completely, because we know that who controls foreign policy in the US? It's the CIA. Okay? It's not like, or at least it's factions within a deeper realm than the president. Right? And so that's another, like, as you keep pointing up, is that the president is proven to be this kind of like not so much powerless but ineffectual character who's kind of just like the end goal of, who's really is the kind of like puppet master, right? Who's like, or not puppet master, sorry, but who's the puppet of a deeper
He's a puppet.
operation.
Well,
Yeah.
and look at Trump. He was a TV star.
Yeah.
He became famous for having an awful reality TV show in which he fired people,
Yeah.
and then he became president.
That
I
was
mean,
his,
Wag the
rebirth.
Dog.
Yeah.
It's just like everything in this movie is exactly what happened, and this war in Ukraine is so perfect because it's like the perfect example of this media war where everything is mediated through these tightly controlled information channels, and like you have this idea that Russia's losing the war. Like that was the narrative for months at the beginning of this war, right? Russia's losing. Russia's on the verge of collapse. And Biden said, we're going to turn the ruble into rubble. Now the ruble is way stronger than it was before the beginning of this war in February. And the euro is becoming rubble. And so like the West keeps saying that like Russia's losing in the media. The media narrative is completely detached from the reality of this war. It's like Wag the Dog. It's like if you watch the media, the presentation of the war in Ukraine is completely detached from reality. Yeah. It's just as fake as the fake Albania war in Wag the Dog. Like they don't mention, for instance, the fact that the war began in 2014.
Yeah.
That when Russia sent its troops in February with the special military operation, that was only a new phase of this war. Yeah. The U.S. started the war in 2014 by overthrowing the elected Ukrainian government in a coup. We have a leaked recording of top U.S. State Department official Victoria Nuland planning who the prime minister of Ukraine would be. All of the top officials would be saying, Arseniy Yatsenuk is our guy. And then he becomes in charge like a few weeks later.
But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yats. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week,
So the U.S. orchestrates this coup and then backs all of these far-right extremists who start waging a war on the Donbass region in the east. According to the United Nations, 14,000 Ukrainians died from 2014 until the end of 2021. All of that history is conveniently erased. The billions of dollars the US and Canada and Europe sent in weapons before February 2022, all of that's erased by the media. And instead, there's this media creation of like the Ukraine war, which is completely detached from reality. And it's just as fake as the Albania war in Wag the Dog.
Well, I mean, it's what's extra sickening is the fact that you have like this very obvious proxy war that people are cheering on in the name of sticking it to Putin, this bad guy. Like, it's like, do you really think that that's the way the world should work? Like, is that really like, is that your kind of like middle school idea of the world? And like, is that how little you care about other places? That like, because you hate this guy that doesn't have anything to do with your own life and your own country, that you've determined that this guy who's popular in his own country, more popular, way more popular than the guy who leads your country, and that's true for the countries that you and I both live in. Well, you're from the US, that like you're from, whatever. That like both like Vladimir Putin has way more popular support, like double than the prime minister of my country, who is the son of a former prime minister who won like a third of the votes, but because of the nature of the Canadian election system, he like fluked his way to like a 2-stage career. Like, if that's not like a broken political system.
The latest poll, Joe Biden has 31% approval, 60% disapproval.
That is,
Putin literally has double his approval rating.
70. It was 70 at one point. I mean, like it's bonkers.
But in Wag the Dog, right? In Wag the Dog, at the end of the movie, you find out that this president, who is involved in this scandal, like with sexually abusing this young girl, he has like over 80% approval rating
Yeah.
because of this
That's-
fake war in Albania.
Yeah.
And it's like, go back to the Bush administration. Bush was extremely unpopular. He wages the war in Iraq, 9/11. He becomes super popular. I mean, that's exactly how this works.
And what's interesting, like the weird thing underneath this too, is that you have the belief that like there is this that the media is some kind of like and it's true, I guess, is that that the idea of what we call the media is this mediating force between power and people, right? And like that's kind of where it's kind of, I mean, I don't know if that's actually true, but it feels like that's the way we like to think of what media does, is that it's this articulating force between, say, the forces of power, which is why a guy like Bob Woodward exists, right? He's an access guy, right? He writes those terrible books for toddlers like every 5 minutes, but in exchange for access, for like going to these places and being given information. Now, a lot of the information is probably fake.
He was a U.S. naval intelligence officer, which is what made it clear to the U.S. deep state that, like, okay, this guy is one of us. He's going to serve our interests. And then he became a journalist and continued playing that same role. Like, that's how this stuff works.
Yeah, and it's part of a class of people. And so what's kind of wrong about this movie is that there's a lot of antagonism set up, but mostly the press kind of very quickly fall in line. And that's actually, I think, pretty true in the sense that, like, because of the kind of like border collie nature of a lot of like liberals, like they kind of just chase after whatever ball is thrown for them. And that ball is often in the hands of like the press secretary of the US, right? Like they have that kind of discursive power to throw a ball and a bunch of like morons with lanyards chase after it for X number of days. Now, I think one thing I've noticed as I've gotten older is like the interval of that period is a lot shorter. So like like a ball, you can only throw a ball and it'll last for like a day, right? Because you have to keep throwing balls out for these border collies and just throw, or Labrador, like golden retriever, whatever. Like you just keep throwing the balls and you have to keep coming back because you have to generate more, especially now that there's so many more sources of information and some of them are antagonistic, right? Like there is an antagonistic class of media people. It's just their antagonism is purely affiliational, right? It's not principled. It's just like, my guy isn't in charge, so I'm going to go hard at this president. So we saw that for 4 years when Trump was president. We suddenly had a media class that had a backbone. Like all of a sudden they grew a backbone and like challenged Trump and whatever, or thought that they did. I mean, it only ended up helping him, I think, in the end, because his ability was to own the libs. So the more that the libs like, got mad at him, the more that it worked out for him. Now, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why he did lose, but I think the big one is COVID. But whatever, that's another conversation. However, what's interesting is that what the plot of the movie has, this other plot inside of it, which is Dustin Hoffman, who's the producer, his own inability to break out of the Hollywood system and his own inability to break out of the laws of the Hollywood system. So like, as you point out, is that he refuses to accept that the president is in charge, that this is his production, right? And it brings all these fun. But really what gets him into trouble is his refusal. He says, I want the credit, right? I want the credit for this. The way that like a Hollywood person would think, right? Like, I want the credit for this movie. And one of his refrains throughout the whole movie is that producers never get credit for anything. Like they're never, the director has
There's
like
no
a chair.
Oscar for best producer.
Yeah, but there is. It's called Best Picture. Producer accepts that, dummy. That's what the producer does. That's the best thing they get. And they're the last ones. That's the centerpiece. So anyways, that was just flat out wrong.
And here's a spoiler, of course, for people watching. Spoiler alert. So he's so insistent on getting credit that the PR guy and the Secret Service turn against him and murder him to hide the story.
And it's so unromanticized. Like it's like one scene where he like gives the guy the nod because Robert De Niro warns him that like, okay, you're playing with your life here, and he says it. And the guy, he storms off because he thinks that he's in Hollywood. But for a second, the realism begins, right? And he's like not protected by the fictionality of the culture industry, where suddenly like the violent nature of Washington power politics makes itself apparent. And it says that if you do this, there are serious consequences to you and your life, that like, if you break this law, that we will not accept this among you. And like, and it's so unromantic. Like he dies in the next scene. Like there's no like Godfather where they go
Well,
and
it's
chop
even better
the
than that.
horse's head. Like there's
Yeah.
no equivalent
Like-
of that. It's just next. It's like he died of a heart attack.
Well, yeah, there's no Khashoggi style
Yeah.
killing. It's just like it shows the next scene is Robert De Niro, the PR guy.
Yes,
He
shows
shows
up,
up at his
yes,
house for a
for a
funeral,
funeral.
and it's on the media, right? Everything is mediated by the media. Reality is there's no reality.
Yeah.
Reality is created by the media.
I mean,
like that's what's so genius about
but-
this. And the people who murdered him are mourning him on TV as his friends, right?
It's sickening. I mean, that's like this, like I mean, it's funny you bring up Khashoggi. Like that Khashoggi was like
He's a great example.
like he was
the attempt to portray him as a martyr. He was a CIA asset who was working with Qatar. In the 1980s, he was working with Saudi intelligence and the CIA to support the Mujahideen. There's all these photos of him with the Mujahideen and like rocket launchers. He was loyal to a different faction of the royal family that got purged by MBS. He was part of he had the wrong loyalty to the wrong part of the family, but he was a complete puppet for the Saudi regime. He didn't care about democracy at all.
Those articles were written
he
by
was a
God
CIA
knows
asset.
wom. The articles he wrote, and all,
By the Qatar
and all of those
Foundation.
like probably some grad student or something, some PhD like me, like working silently for dollars in some room elsewhere, and like and then watching all of his so-called colleagues perform a kind of mourning ritual for him. It's like, are you kidding me? Like you're in this dirty business. Like, and like this is Trump. To Trump's credit, Trump said all the things like, oh, this is fake news. And he was right. It is fake news. Now, of course, he's part of his own fake news, which is hilarious. But he's like, oh, their fake news is bad. Believe mine. And it worked. It worked on tens of millions of Americans.
He's part of his own reality TV show that he creates. But he understands that you just create your own reality TV show. And the thing about Khashoggi is like, if you read Khashoggi's awful articles, he was like writing U.S. propaganda. I talked about this in a recent video and podcast I did about Biden's Saudi so-called reset and all that propaganda. But Khashoggi was like writing articles calling for breaking up Syria and carving it up on sectarian lines and saying like the U.S. should be the one that does this because the U.S. is the only responsible actor. Like that's the kind of propaganda he was writing. And he was turned through this media propaganda into like this great martyr for freedom. I mean, it's exactly, it shows the power of the media apparatus. I mean, they really do create
It also
reality.
shows the contradictions because on the one hand, there is a Saudi, and I say this a lot on the show, on my show, is that like there are rival information warfare tactics, right? That like rival parties that all have a foothold in America that had different interests, sometimes coinciding, other times not, conflicting. And Syria was one of them, whereby the Qatari Turkish wing of it he was a part of, that he then got himself mixed up against the Saudi wing of that dirty war. And he was a victim of that contradiction. And so because he like joined the faction that was against MBS, and and then what was crazy is that like his death was then exploited, it's like they took the dead corpse of his guy and jammed him into the same machine that killed him and like reused his meat for like anti-Saudi stories, which is exactly what they did.
like Sweeney Todd imperial
Because
propaganda.
first it was for Syria and God knows what. It was using it like he was some puppet, he was some Arab comprador face. There's a lot of them, and then you can just kind of, and then he was used for anti-Saudi stuff. They used his corpse. I mean, these are these normie blue check media people. This is the cutthroat world. Like they're every bit as violent as the despots that they supposedly cover. But because that violent is like mediated through words and discourse, right? That it's somehow not deemed to be violent. That like, all these liberal journos running through Syria, through these occupied parts, embedded with like right-wing Salafi journalists who then some rival versions of those go off and kill them, right? That like all the interceding parties of Syria that they grabbed from everywhere, the cavalcade of scum that they recruited from everywhere. Yeah, a lot of them are going to fight with each other, it turns out. And sometimes they use the journalists that are deployed to help sell the dirty war as, say, a civil war, right? That then they get turned on and they're used as like, okay, we're going to chop this person's head off. This person's like whatever, Marie Colvin or whatever. Like, classic example, right? She was warned, don't go into these areas. We can't protect you. And look what happened. Like, and then like this is the dirty business of being part of these dirty wars. And we, because of the liberal media, because the liberal media has a stake in manufacturing these people as courageous actors on the front line, right? Like this romantic photojournalist arc, like it turned into the romantic vlogger, right? Like, because they have a stake in manufacturing this image, they create these martyrs. They create these martyrs in the sense that, oh, like they were a minor figure in their lives and then turned into great martyrs, right? So like the story of Daniel Pearl, right? Daniel Pearl's legacy was used to wage more war, right? Like that guy's death was to called upon to wage more war. Like that's the reality, the sickening war addicted parasitic imperialist system that we live in, is that in the end everything will get turned into this kind of like sludge for that will fed into the war machine. So like Ukrainian refugees will be forced to make TikToks where they like talk about like how evil Putin is while they're sitting in some like refugee camp somewhere, like being miserable. Although their refugee conditions have been much, much better. Like their refugee plight has been very much. I mean, we know this and everything.
I'm glad you mentioned TikTok because those reports of the White House is like briefing TikTokers on how to talk about the Ukraine war. That is like how to spread anti-Russian propaganda on behalf of the U.S. empire. I mean, it's so perfect. It's Wag the Dog again. The U.S. government is spending its resources talking to teenagers on TikTok to help them spread information war against Russia. It's so perfect.
There's a contradiction here too, like a philosophical contradiction, is because there's a famous Princeton study where they kind of measured the amount of impact that an American citizen has on their elected officials, which is to say like how Democrat, and it's like zero. It's like nothing. They have zero influence. So then you have to ask yourself, why do the scum, evil, mustache twirling like nut jobs who cook these things up? Why does it matter to them that people sign on to this? Like, I honestly wonder that. Like, what difference does it make that like John Q, John Q, like it's administrator at the local school board, puts a Ukraine flag on his car and donates $1 of his grocery store purchase? Like, what does it matter to them? Like, what this guy thinks? Like, I really wonder that sometimes. Like, do you have an answer to that question?
No, I mean, I agree with you that the point of manufacturing consent is to target people, especially people who are left-leaning, right? Because you don't need to manufacture consent for the right wing. The audience for a lot of this propaganda is domestic. You said that earlier, and it's exactly right. It's not for people around the world. It's to manufacture consent among the domestic population, especially young people who are often more skeptical of authority and people who are left-leaning. So, I mean, Wag the Dog is also a good example with the fact that it's touching into Hollywood and the power of these movies and TV shows. I mean, think about really popular TV shows like Stranger Things, a very well-done show. Immediately, clearly, it was very popular, and the U.S. government was like, we could use this as propaganda. Out of nowhere, in season 3, it suddenly becomes like an insane anti-Russian show. Out of nowhere. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, it took on terrible, and all the cliches of like, oh, the Soviet guy loves American cartoons and Pepsi Cola.
Yeah, and then season 4. So season 3 is straight up anti-Russian propaganda. Season 4, they go to the Soviet Union, and it's just like insane anti-Soviet and anti-Russian propaganda.
Russiagate ate at the writers of that show. I mean, what's crazy is that Russiagate itself is Wag the Dog. They cooked it up on the night of her election.
It is Wag the Dog.
Eating pizza and drinking beer. They were like, how are we going to spin this? They're like, oh, blame Russia. Like, you think it's made up, but it's true.
Or Bountygate.
Oh, yes.
Remember, Russia's paying the Taliban bounties to kill U.S. soldiers because clearly they weren't motivated to kill the people occupying their country for 20 years. And then, of course, a few months later, after they used that media fake story to try to block the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, a few months the CIA admitted, oh, actually, that was a fake story. There was no evidence of that. It was Wag the Dog.
Or Havana syndrome. Like, it's all like every like
Oh my
you.
God.
I mean, I know we're in this business too of like doing the angel of history thing of just looking at the rubble and like talking about it. But like, at what point do you be like, am I the only sane person here that sees this? Like, am I actually losing my mind that like on the local, classical station in my town, they're like Zelensky's a man of the people, servant of the now available on Netflix, and it's like, oh, I know. Like, why am I hearing like cheap, corny advertisement for the proxy puppet leader in this proxy war led by the US? Like, why am I hearing that when I want Tchaikovsky or something?
Oh, Tchaikovsky's banned now. Tchaikovsky's banned now for being Russian.
They did that. Oh my god, it's so fucking stupid. We live in the stupidest era of human history, and our cursed task in life. I mean, you have to put that GIF in from Clockwork Orange. Like, this is our task in life: is to just force our eyes open and stare at it and be like, "Am I crazy for seeing this stuff that like we knew?" Like they openly admitted that RussiaGate was cooked up over pizza and beer, and we still lived through 4 years of it. We lived through 4 years.
Sina, you'd appreciate this as a PhD in comp lit. You know, in Candide by Voltaire, there's that candidate Pangloss, who's always like, "We live in the best of all possible worlds. We live in the best of all possible worlds." I often take that on its head, right? We live in the stupidest of all possible worlds, where we had a reality TV show president, Donald Trump. Now we have a senile,
like just
walking zombie who's our president. And then we have Zelensky, who's like Wag the Dog fake TV president. I mean, we live in the stupidest of all possible worlds.
Just getting stupider.
Europe is trying to destroy Russia, and it's destroying itself. It's owning itself more than Russia could ever imagine, could ever.
Like, just all these pensioners freezing in their homes or baking like crusty souffle in the house in south of France. After everything that Sarkozy,
Russia's making more money than ever before.
Yeah, it's crazy, and we're supposed to sit here and call this democracy. I mean, this is the nutty thing. Like, they call this democracy. They call this like freedom.
There's a few small things I wanted to mention also in this movie that we had to talk about. So first of all, I mean, there's the obvious fact that they pick Albania, which I mean, it's a largely Muslim country. And this was before the war on terror. So it shows that this like Islamophobic narrative was still very deep in US culture in the 1990s. This is 1997, right? And I thought that was also really funny. I had to mention this with you because, Albania is now the host of the MEK.
Yes,
like
true.
The anti-Iran cult. The MEK is based in Albania.
Albania
right?
is one of these sad,
and they are also like a Wag the Dog creation. They're this insane fanatical cult that like the founder, what's his name?
Rajavi.
He's dead, but they act as though he's still alive. Yeah. And like his wife is in charge, and they all just like Wag the Dog style. They pretend that he's really alive, and some of their followers obviously believe that he's still alive, even though he's clearly dead. And like it's this insane cult where like they don't allow people to be in relationships.
They're forced to write their sexual thoughts in a journal. It's all it's like it's as freaky as Scientology, but funded by Saudis and pushed by Zionists. Like it's
and the US
and they're Marxists also. Did I mention that part? Like they're Marxist-Leninists.
Well, they used to be, but then they like in the 1990s they just became neoliberals and they said they support the free market, and then the US was like, okay, we'll support you now. Like,
and I forgot about that connection. Albania, yeah, that's true. Albania, Tirana is now hosting these freaks.
And then I had to mention this also, Sina, as as our honorary Canadian here. Also, the fact that it's so funny, they don't even think about it. They start jeopardizing Canada's policy by saying, all right, so what we're going to say is this Albanian terrorist flew to Canada with a suitcase nuclear bomb, and he's on the Canadian border, and they don't consult with Canada. Obviously, they don't consult with Albania. They don't care about Albania, but they don't even think for a second, like, maybe we should talk to the Canadian Prime Minister. No, we're just going to throw Canada in here and threaten Canada with all of this.
What the encounter with the CIA was funny because the CIA, like if they didn't want this, like the thought that the CIA wouldn't have been involved with this is also, I think, very, very wrong. Is that like this kind of
Well, no, Sina, I agree this is realistic because the CIA at first didn't know about it and they were
That's true,
angry.
yeah.
And then once they figured out about it, they're
That's
like,
true. That
okay,
is
we're
true.
fine.
That is correct.
You just
yeah.
have to tell us.
They didn't like not
You have to
being
tell us
asked,
what's going on.
which is actually, and it's so funny that like William H. Macy shows up with this like G-men outfit. It's the most cliched image, and they like stop them somewhere, and they kind of have to talk themselves out of it. God, this movie is so good. It is every scene is so good, and oh god, I can't get over it. I want to watch it again. I watched it 3 times.
Sina, another good point I wanted to make. You mentioned like the press officers. Again, we live in Wag the Dog. The White House press officer, Jen Psaki, she left the White House and she was the White House press officer. She's now a pundit on MSNBC.
Yeah.
Jen Psaki. And by the way, the State Department spokesman, Ned Price, is a former CIA agent, former in scare quotes, former CIA agent, and he resigned from the CIA in protest under Trump. And he's like, I'm an openly gay CIA agent. I resigned from the CIA because Trump, big bad orange boogeyman. And he wrote an article in the Washington Post. It's like, once again, Wag the Dog, man. We live in Wag the Dog.
And I guess the thing is that there's more factionalism in like the American deep state, and they do fight with each other. And actually, in this movie, they show that in the sense that the rival who's running against him for president, against the incumbent president, is that he tries to kind of like benefit from the situation and tries to take control discursively of the situation by saying, "Oh, Albania has stood down." And so like the task of the movie is to get everyone involved in the distraction as much as possible. And that's actually what happened with Iraq. That the WMD thing was a complete, not just a fabrication, but here's the thing. If Iraq had WMDs, they wouldn't have invaded. Okay? So it actually, because that's the whole point of having WMDs, is that you stop them from invading, right? So like the very premise itself was contradictory, and we were forced to participate in it. We were forced, like at discursive gunpoint, to say, "Oh no, Iraq doesn't have WMDs. It's fake. It's fake." Because, and then underneath that, we're supposed to do the underlying logic of the right to protect and the right to intervene, right? Is that underneath that you're supposed to saying that is that, oh, because there is this bad actor, the world's hegemon needs to intervene. So we're debating that point, whether or not Iraq is the big bad actor. And even that was the so-called anti-war left, like that was the talking point. It was that, oh, it's not as bad of an actor as you think. It wasn't that, oh, war is bad. This is an empire. I mean, of course, some people were saying that, but the predominant kind of like liberal force of that so-called resistance to Bush, it was purely on the principles of, oh, this doesn't satisfy the empire's needs of falling in, right? Like, because Kosovo is in the background of this movie, right? And that's actually what this movie is kind of calling up, is that the right to protect and the right to intervene.
Well, and
Right.
the Gulf War.
Yeah,
And the Gulf War in particular. Like there's a part where they even mention the Gulf War. I wrote this down actually. The presidential assistant, like this young woman, she's like, wait, but what you're saying about Albania is not true. And then De Niro's character, the PR guy, he says, well, it doesn't matter that it's not true. What about the Gulf War? He names the Gulf War. So it's exactly, babies in incubators, right? I mean, that was real. Like the US government falsely claimed that the Iraqi military, after invading Kuwait, after the US gave Iraq the green light to invade Kuwait, then the U.S. claimed that the Iraqi soldiers were going into hospitals and taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators and leaving them on the ground to die. And that lie was first spread by the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. Of course, they didn't mention that. She testified in Congress, and then all the media outlets spread that lie. I mean, the Gulf War is a classic example of this Wag the Dog scenario. And then, of course, there's the Libya War with the false claims spread by Hillary Clinton that Gaddafi was giving Viagra to his soldiers, encouraging them to abuse women. And, the chemical attacks in Syria and the white helmets. I mean, you could go on the list. The Gulf of Tonkin. Like, it's all a big Wag the Dog.
You like try to not be the guy who's like, it's all a big lie, and we're all subject to this lie, because you're like, no, it can't be like that. Like, no, it is like that, and it's actually worse, because the people who are lying also say what they're doing. They narrate their own lies and laugh as they're doing it, because whereas in the Wag the Dog movie, there is this veneer of reality that they put on, right? That like, oh, that this fictional war is in fact like non-fictional, right? Whereas here they're saying that, oh no, this is all a big scam. Like we know this, we know it's all fake, and like it's okay, and you can just agree with it. And and the fact is, and going back to that study, that Princeton study, is that whether you agree with it or not, it doesn't matter. We're going to enact these things. We have the cold political power in this country to do these things, and we're going to do it and try to stop us, which is essentially what happened with Iraq, right? That like the country was mostly against it. Even the bloodthirsty American imperialists were mostly against it, at least population. But whoever said that American population determines foreign policy? When has that ever been the case? Right? Is that this is the like in this moments like this where you have to do like the Karl Popper thing, like the falsifiability of something. It's openly clear that this is false. Like you can say that like the principles of liberal imperialism are false. That like, and it was funny that at the end of the movie that there's this news report. You should probably clip it in because it turns out they do go back to Albania after all. That there is this like military.
Well, no, what I love about that ending, Sina, is it's deliberately ambiguous. It's a brilliant ending because at the end of the movie, of course, the president, spoiler alert, the president wins re-election, he stays in power, and then at the end of the movie, they say that there was a terrorist bombing by an Albanian group. But what I love about it is you don't know if it's real or if it's another manufactured media scandal because the movie taught you that you never know if it's real.
It's
because everything's
satire.
all fake.
Like it just nailed it. Yeah.
It's perfectly ambiguous. They don't provide any answer. They just leave it on that ambiguous note because that's how our reality is. It's that ambiguous.
Like the exposition of the movie, they accomplish it through a news clip. That like you're always, and the idea of the news itself, it's so crazy. Like, oh, we're just holding up a mirror to the day's events. Like you give us 30 minutes, we'll give you the world, right? And like, as opposed to like the reality, which is like every second of the news is pre-purchased in a sense by vested interest, and it might not be direct and it might be not so crass. Sometimes it is crass that you can see that like one clear channel like represent that like all those like when you're listening to like a local radio station, a so-called local radio station, all those like news tidbits are fed to them, right? That like, oh, today is International like sofa chair day, where you're supposed to whatever, like all that shit is just sent to them, like it's delivered to them that in the most Soviet of ways possible. But because it's a private corporation doing it, and that it's okay, right? That it makes sense to us. That it's like, oh, it's just marketing. That like our news is marketing, and it's just done by different means, and it's manufactured for us as this thing called news. But we all know that it's just like marketing. I mean, what's crazy now is that news, at least local news, is basically like, here's what was popular on social media today. Like, here's what went viral. Here's a video of a bear throwing a frisbee. Like that's it. That's like the second half of the news today is like what was popular on Facebook, because that's like the mediation. It's like the snake eating its own tail of representation. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's like the corporate media Ouroboros from hell or something. But Sina, on this point of, the corporate media just amplifying these fake stories that are like rumors in social media or whatever. I mean, there's another parallel to the war going on in Ukraine, the proxy war against Russia, that is so accurate in this movie, Wag the Dog. There's this part where the president's team falsely creates this story of this guy, William Schuman, this soldier who's supposedly caught behind enemy lines in Albania in this fake war. And then they find this prisoner named William Schuman. He's not actually a soldier. He's a straight up crazy prisoner. And there's this part where the media gets leaked a photo of him supposedly captured behind enemy lines in Albania. And he has a sweater on. And the sweater has Morse code. And supposedly in Morse code, it says, "Courage, Mom. Courage, Mom." And then that becomes this slogan, right? That everyone repeats. They like spray paint "Courage, Mom." It's on all the media. And this is exactly like this fake story at Snake Island, right? Remember? A completely fake story where Ukrainian soldiers allegedly were going to be massacred by Russia on Snake Island. And they supposedly said, "F you, Russian ship," or "Russian ship, F you." And now that's become like this slogan that you see all over, like on media outlets, on social media, like spray painted, "Russian ship, F you." It's a completely fake story, just like Albania in Wag the Dog, or the Ghost of Kiev. Remember that? Like there's a story like this Ukrainian pilot, completely fake story. And then also another fake story of like they used this video game footage and they said it was like Russia bombing Ukraine. Like those are 3 blatantly fake stories that were spread all across mainstream media, just like Wag the Dog. I mean, just as fake as the Albania war in Wag the Dog.
I mean that the goal. I think ultimately, like to answer my own question about like what's the point of convincing John Q. school board employee like of the importance of Zelensky. That like I think it's like it's more to do with the fact of like you shovel enough bullshit into the public sphere, just shovel it all out. It doesn't mean anything. You just shovel it out, and it keeps everyone busy, right? That like the and it just and you can block out any of the noise that any freaks like you and me might bring up of like, oh yeah, there was this thing called a proxy war, like, oh yeah, there was this thing called a coup. That like if you can just shovel enough shit, that's enough for most people who kind of like we're the exception to people, like in the sense that like we care about the news.
We're what that means is we're crazy. We're crazy enough to care.
Yeah, we're crazy for doing this stuff, and it's like our job to do this stuff.
Masochists.
It's like our professional domain. Exactly, but it's like, but most people don't care. It's like passive to them. Their lives are hard enough, and that the outside world. Like I met a person. I mean, this was like in rural northern Ontario. They're like, where are you from? And I was like, Iran. They're like, what's that? Like they had never heard of Iran before. Like, and it was actually nice. It was actually like refreshing. I was like, oh, that's nice that some of the propaganda didn't get to you. That like you never heard of, like this person never heard of Not Without Your Daughter, without my daughter. Like, good, that's nice. Like they start from zero. Like that was, but like most people don't care. Like most people do not care about this stuff. They don't pay attention. That it's just periphery for them, and that like the few who do watch 30 minutes of like some national news broadcaster, like in Canada at CBC, and like that's enough for them. And like the last 15 minutes are a mixture of ads and feel good
Yeah.
stories that are like, that it's like, oh, here's the bad news. And here's like, it's like us. We did our vegetables first and then we had our dessert, like,
Well,
like
Sina, you know what
that's
this
it.
also reminds me of is there's this phenomenon that the CIA has sometimes talked about in its documents where the CIA creates so much fake news and information warfare that, I mean, they created disinformation, quite literally. They created the tactic. And then the CIA, sometimes its own so-called intelligence for the president and other, government officials is actually sometimes polluted by the very same fake news they created. They actually sometimes don't even know it's real. It's amazing.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah, I believe it. And then you can because you always win. It doesn't. There's no connection to something called
Yeah.
reality. Like we really want. And this was the Trump era was full of this. Was full of like thousands, possibly tens of thousands of these Anglophone liberals, all far flung places of the earth, mostly America, but in other places, who were trawling through everything. Like the guy, the Toronto Star guy who got bumped up to New York Times guy or Washington Post guy, Daniel something. He like followed Trump everywhere and like wrote down all of his lies. And it's like, do you really think this will change anything? You think that and first of all, they never did that for Obama, which they should have. Of course they didn't. But let's say you track all of Trump's lies. Like what then? Do you think like it matters to either him, his supporters, and more importantly, the political ghouls who control him? Do you think it matters that he lied or is a hypocrite? Do you think it matters? And it's like this belief in liberals that that there is this leader out there, there is this general out there, this Cincinnati
Rules-based international order.
that just if you just have the right like ethical subject, ethical individual who's doing that work, that somehow that this good thing will evolve. And that was the Obama's work. He was tasked with redeeming the US empire, and that's what he did. That was his success. They took Bush, who was this evil character, who was the son of evil, right? And they transformed it. They changed it. They put this new they changed this they put this new avatar and they called it Obama. And like, he threw a couple of bones to his domestic audience. In the end, it didn't prove to be much. Obamacare didn't last, right? And like all the union things were clawed back in the first year, environmental elections. Like it was all just a veneer of democratic, sort of social democratic agenda. But in the end, he continued the same imperialist policies. The same thing Trump did, he continued them too. Same thing Biden did, right? It's not Hillary Clinton's White House, but it doesn't matter. It does, because ultimately in the end, the US empire is this cruise ship and it's just hurtling towards its
An
own
iceberg
destination,
that it
an
created,
iceberg that,
that it
it
built.
created. Yeah. And like,
Sina, I mean,
and you
I'm glad
just
you
are forced to sit and watch.
I'm glad you mentioned Obama, because there's another part in this movie. I'm almost done with my notes here, but there was a part where they're like, maybe we should give the president a Nobel Peace Prize, right? And then Robert De Niro was like, well, if Henry Kissinger could get one. And then I was like, well, this was made in the 1990s. I was like, well, if Obama could get one. Remember, Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize just for being elected. He didn't do anything.
Just for not being Bush.
Yeah.
He got elected.
And it's like, well, if Obama could get a Nobel Peace Prize with the coup in Honduras, the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the war in Afghanistan he didn't end, then yeah, this president whose face we never see, this faceless president who starts the fake war in Albania, he should get a Nobel Peace Prize too, because it's just like, that's how illegitimate it is.
In conclusion, nothing is real. Nothing is real. We live in the worst of all simulations, where we know that it's a simulation, and yet we all are forced to abide by its like stupid Star Trek holograph.
I have two final notes here, Sina. One, toward the end of the movie, when there's like the people showing like the popular enthusiasm for hating Albania, there's this guy with like an F Albania t-shirt. And it shows like how, I mean, this like hatred of Iran or Iraq or Venezuela or China or
Ayatollah
Russia.
Asahola.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's all just completely manufactured. These people don't know anything about Iran or China or Russia.
Yeah.
They're just taught to hate these countries. And you can see that with like polls of China. Now it's like a majority have negative views. I mean, this is, George Bush met with Putin and was like, I saw in his eyes and I saw he has a soul. And it's like, I mean, they just completely flip on a dime when it's convenient for the U.S. empire. And then the media tells everyone, you have to hate this country. And then they hate it. And then they buy t-shirts that say like F Albania. I mean, it's perfect.
Yeah. No, yeah. I saw on my, like at the corner, one of the busiest intersections of Toronto, there were 5 pro-Ukrainian, I'm assuming at least a few of them were Ukrainian. But they were all pro-Ukrainian, obviously. And one of them said, kill Putin. Like literally, like if you did that with any, like if a Palestinian did that with a leader, if they said like kill Netanyahu or something, they would be arrested on the spot. They would be arrested and they would have possibly terrorism charges put against them, right? Like you can't fly a flag of Hezbollah, like in this country, in the UK, in the US, right? Like they'll literally come after you for like material support of terrorists, right? That like that's what they'll do. They will go hard against, and yet you are allowed to say like kill the leader of this foreign country, right? That like you're allowed to openly say that, like openly advocate for murder of these like international leader, which in effect would start World War III as well. Just to mention that also. I mean, it's crazy. It's bonkers. It's bonkers.
Sina, when I see people like that with Ukraine, they love Ukraine. It's like like the hipster albums joke, but it's like, okay, you love Ukraine. Name your 3 favorite presidents aside from Zelensky.
Yeah.
Who was the last president before Zelensky?
I love Poroshenko.
Finally, my last note here, Sina, is one of my favorite moments in this movie, Wag the Dog. Great note to end on. The Hollywood producers, there's this part where he's writing the speech for the president. Perfect moment. He's literally writing the president's speech. We never see the president's face. And this Hollywood producer is sitting in the president's desk in the Oval Office. And he gives this speech like to the audience that's listening. And then all these people come out, they're crying at how beautiful the speech was. And then he says after that scene, the Hollywood producer walks out of the Oval Office and he says, I felt so much at home. I could have gone this way. It's only a change of wardrobe. And that's true.
Yeah,
like
it's true.
The only difference between these Hollywood actors and the president is a suit. That's it.
I mean, Trump was a game show host and he remained a game show host. Like he remained a game show host.
And
he
the thing about Trump
a game
is,
show host and he stayed.
And he always understood that it's a game show and that he creates his own reality. And what I wanted to conclude this episode with is this article from the Atlantic magazine, 2009, title, We're an Empire Now, and when we act, we create our own reality. That's the famous quote from a senior advisor to President Bush. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. That is the reality. That's the truth of the U.S. empire and the media, which is the handmaiden of empire.
Like whatever dream world you want to live in, you can just dream it up and make it on demand. And if you want to like shut up, like overnight, they expelled all these Russian institutions. They orchestrated a major like economic boycott, like things that harmed the bottom lines of major corporations, things that like went against the interests of say TikTok or these big department stores or oil companies. They went against their interest. Maybe not oil companies, but tech companies, for instance, like they lost stuff. They lost employees. They lost markets, right? Like at a time when their own like business models are suffering, like they had to take it from the U.S. deep state and say, "Oh, we're doing this now." So it's like it's so crazy to then turn around and have most of us think that, oh, we live in a democracy where every periodically we go and have our say and our politicians do our bidding or they represent our bidding, right? Like it's nuts. It's nuts. Ben Norton, friend of the podcast, patron of the podcast, longtime guest of the podcast. Thank you. These were amazing. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sina. For people who don't know, I guess this episode's kind of like a joint episode because I'm going to be posting it at Multipolarista. This is Sina Rahmani, who's an awesome, great podcaster, troublemaker. Your handle is @YourOrientalist. You are Orientalist, right?
Yeah, you are Orientalist. Yeah.
Yeah, great friend of the show, and I guess I've been following his show from the very beginning. So yeah, I mean, I'll be editing this. So if you're watching this or listening to this, it could be on his show, East is a Podcast. It could be on my YouTube channel, Multipolarista. And because of censorship, it's going to be backed up on Rockfin, Rumble, and Odyssey. So yeah, I mean.
Oh yeah, you might get demonetized for this, probably, right?
Well, yeah. Well, I guess this is the end of the episode, so people probably recognize. I'm not going to use the audio. The secret is to not use the audio from the movie, to use the video. That's why I read the quotes instead of showing the quotes. Because if you use the video, they won't demonetize it. But if you use the audio, they'll not only will they demonetize it, they'll actually like ban it in certain countries.
I thought they'll just demonetize it because we did thought crime. Because we're endorsing Russia. They might do that.
Because of that, because we're talking about Russia and Ukraine and propaganda, they'll probably demonetize it just because of that. But I don't want them to ban it because of intellectual property or whatever. I mean, these are the fascists that rule us.
Yeah, the techopoly that we have to navigate. It's crazy. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Sina. It was a great conversation. Very fun. I'm glad we could do this.
This is my first time on your show, I realized.
Yeah, well, you'll be back many, many, many more times.
Yeah. Take care, Ben.
You too.